What is up, PPL people? Webs is here, bringing you guys the post-draft power rankings, and I'm gonna be your host for this little video show that we are gonna be going through these rankings that myself and some of the other analysts who are gonna be joining here very briefly are gonna be hearing each of their voices stating their opinion about these drafts. Make sure to check out the draft stream if you are interested to see that. It went live just on this Sunday, and you don't want to miss out on that. It was a very nice show for them to do. Let's jump into the first team that we are going to be talking about. We are here for Q, who is the 9th team that we are going to be covering through, and this is going to be a team that I think it's gonna be it could be very controversial how you see it. It may not be. Like, I have a hunch that it may end up being one of these things that people look at this and see that this looks very fun. I think this can be very good what it does when it's put it in a right position, and it does seem to have a lot of upside when you look at the offensive threats alongside with Grimstar with dual screens, and Hisui and Sora be able to disguise as some of them. But for me, the fact that your round 1 pick is not something else than other than Hisui and Lilligant, not saying that Hisui and Lilligant should not be drafted in general. I do think that's a really cool and good mon to draft, like late round 2 or round 3 for example, but as a round 1 I find it a little bit of reach compared to some of the other mons that he had available at this point of the draft, that I thought he could have tried to get them first. Or one of them first, and then followed up with the things that he did, and that could have already by itself made a lot different scenery for me to look at this draft and where I would have placed it myself. But I just find that round 1 Lilligant to be a little bit of quote-unquote throw in some aspects compared to what other people were able to draft in their round 1 picks from there on out. But other than that, I think the team in itself can be very fun and it has great upside yet again, like I said. But the issues for me is that it is very risky, and it's gonna be very tough sometimes if the things don't go exactly according to the plan of Q, whatever game plan he might end up having in when it comes to like which mon he plans to be the winning condition, which one does the breaking and what have you. When you have so little defensive backbone to realistically rely on, and a lot of the offensive mons he possesses don't necessarily have a lot of natural bulk either, which in some cases you can argue that, well, that's why the Crimson is there to provide that bulk through the dual screens. But what if the opponent is ready for that? What if they are bringing their brick break as a attacking move, which is entirely gonna deter that, or they happen to have a default user, which he cannot necessarily punish in some way or anyways, because there's no defiant mode necessary to punish that kind of scenario. So in some aspects like that, I just find it a little ambitious in some regards and very risky draft. Not necessarily that it doesn't have any upside to do well, even if I rank it very low like I did. But I'm gonna leave the floor next here to someone that have been very, or at least a lot more higher on this draft, and it was actually Bruno and Squid who had notes together, and one of them is gonna be at least covering here why they think about this a very more highly than, for example, myself did in my power rankings.
So me and Bruno actually put this 5th place. And while I wouldn't ever draft a team like this, and that is due to 2 main reasons. One, you have the cleaver, which is something that hyper offensive always wanted to have in hazard stacking while attacking. That's just 2 for 1. And you have Grimsnarl, which does 2 very important things for hyper offensive in setting up screens. And Grimsnarl is arguably the best screener in this generation. And also having parting shot to allow the frailer, hard-hitting ones to come in much more safely. To that point, he also has Cyclozar to help with pivoting a lot. And he also has a really good secondary screener, in my opinion, in Bronzong. Because with this team, I'm seeing double screen Bronzong coming in at least once. That may free up Grimsnarl to be something like a setup sweeper or something like that. And Hisui and Zoroark being able to play mind games with the opponents, I feel like will be pretty good with such an offensive backed team. Because opponents, if they see Zoroark in the team preview, they are gonna be constantly asking, is he Zoroark Hisui? Can he hit me? Can he not hit me? And sometimes people will make the right decision against Q, sometimes they will make the wrong decision against Q, and he may capitalize on that. To that point, Veps is saying that Lilligant is not the round pick one that I would like to see. I totally agree with that. I wouldn't ever pick Lilligant Hisui because 80% accuracy is not my vibe at all.
Okay, and then as the 11th draft for us to cover is gonna be Lars, aka ElCiso, who is obviously a very long, well-known draft league player from GBA days already, which makes me nostalgic to see him playing, which is great to see. And he was able to draft himself Roaring Moon, Corviknight, Rillaboom, and the roster goes from there. And I can tell you from the fact that this team might be one of the bulkiest teams that we're gonna be end up seeing, but with a little bit of offensive options and a good amount of hazard stacking, which particularly the latter one I feel like is gonna be the essential part for this team to do what it needs to do every single week and be able to find success. Personally, the team that is this bulky and lacks a little bit of breaking prowess in my eyes made it very low on my power rankings because I find it tough for him to find in some matchups to enable to force progress in the battle outside of his hazards that he has in Azelf and Frostlass, for example, as a combination, or Mudsdale as another stealth rock setter. And I feel like in a bulkier draft, you want to have more hazards enabled to force your opponent to take damage when they are coming into the field, enable to force your defensive monster that you have on the field. And I think it's also important that if they aren't taking hazard damage, they are then forced into a situation that they are running heavy duty boots, which makes them less stronger because they don't have a boosting item to make sure to bypass your bulk in itself that you have available to you when you have a bulkier team by itself. So I think while you do technically have some hazards there, I would have loved to see a lot more there to enable his kind of bulkier style of approach that he took on this draft to function even better and therefore being a better team overall in my eyes in itself. Now obviously there's gonna be a lot of like desire and need that I see on this team, being a bulkier team that he's gonna be offensively challenged in some weeks, enable forcing that progress, which is again something that I do worry. And I think in some cases if you find a player coach who knows and has the tools to break your defensive core, it's gonna be a lot tougher for you to find a different kind of approach to those games because you basically have this much amount of bulk with basically most of your points spent on those scenarios. So for me, this was a draft that I ended up putting myself pretty low in this regard, and it also didn't help the fact that while I do think he has cool Terra captains that I don't disregard that they cannot utilize them in their favors in Florges and Grafai, I kind of wish in this kind of scenario he would have found himself a more offensive Terra captains to really force that progress and being those big threats, and especially help therefore run out his first round pick Roaring Moon to be freed up to get through some of the fatter stuff. So Roaring Moon without being a Terra Captain option at all, which it wasn't able to be, can function even better because I do think a Roaring Moon without Terra Captaincy is a little bit more offensively struggled in some matchups than you normally think about it that it would be. So that's kind of my 2 cents on Lars' team, and I'm gonna be letting a Bruno or Squid, depending on which one we happen to get on this scenario, to cover their perspective when they made their rankings about Lars' roster.
Okay, so we rank this 4th. I think this has arguably the best defensive core in the league. Corviknight, Dondozo, Mudsdale, Florges. I think Florges as a Terra Captain has other capabilities other than defensive ones. but really nice defensive core. I can see the lack of offense that this team can have sometimes. Of course, heavily relying on Rory Moon. Derrilla, it's most likely they can work as a mostly a pivot man, but I think it will most likely, just because he lacks some offense, it will have to be more of an offensive threat, which without Jurassic Light, I'm not entirely sure. I didn't form an opinion about Rillaboom without Jurassic Light, to be honest. Pomot has coverage, I guess, can be decent for 10 points. Can actually do some stuff. It's a Pokemon that I actually like. And Espatra now as Azelf, which, I mean, I kind of like Azelf more, because I think it can, with Nasty Plot, be a huge threat, as Espatra, I mean, can run Calm Mind, but it's not amazing without the Terra option. So I think even Espatra on this team will have to run a lot of choice packs with like Lumina Crash, or just try to do damage with the Lumina Crash, try to lower the speed def of the opponents, which could be, again, countered by just a Covert Cloak. But now he has Elf, which I like it more, honestly. But yeah, overall, I think this team it's a bulky offense team that more bulk than offense. But I think it's really, really well rounded, and that's why we rank it 4th. Rory Moon, I will say, not the biggest fan, but at the same time, he has so many physical threats like Corviknight, Mudsdale, Dondozo, that I can see Rory Moon. And looking at other teams, I can see Rory Moon doing nice things here. And Terra Florges, I really like it. I think it allows Florges to be a bit more offensive, especially with Calm Mind sets, having the option to ground and water, which I really, really enjoy. So yeah.
And then we have next to be covered Drewboy, who is a coach that I'm somewhat familiar with, because in the past I've actually helped him building every now and then when he was playing for WBE in last generation and seasons prior to that. And he is back now in the draft league scene, as we can see, which I'm very excited to see for himself. And he drafted a Sun team, which is gonna be actually the only I would call a dedicated weather team that we get to see this season, which is no surprise that it's gonna be Sun in this generation, as we know, because there's a lot more abuses for Sun this generation that can be utilized, either photosynthesis ability, or we have also the new toy that has now been around for a while, but it's still somewhat definitely a new toy in draft league scene, in Walking Wake. And then pair that with Cinderace, which is a liberal user by itself, and having access to those stronger Pyro Balls under the Sun is gonna be very tough for some teams to be able to handle, even how predictable they are. But they have very spammable stab moves to click under the Sun that is gonna be very, very tough for teams to handle, depending on who they are going up against. And he also has a very good hazard stacking core in Klefki and Clodside together. Paired that with a couple of pretty good rapid spinners compared to other teams that were able to draft any removals in general, with Torkoal and Resileki. And then he also has a more niche option as just a full-on hazard remover that there's no stopping to in Mouse Hold as well in the back. And as overall, the team is very Sun-based, which is always cool to see, and I'm excited to see how Drew is able to make it work. But as a call it a personal bias, I'm not super fan of usually in drafts to going full on weather team. I like weather in drafts, and I do think it has merit to it. I just don't believe that you should dedicate your entire draft for that niche. Now you can obviously argue that some mons are not dedicated to work always in Sun, like Clodside and Klefki obviously are in dedicated Sun mons, but basically your main approach offensively wise are basically dedicated around the Sun for the most part, which is usually the reason why I don't like it in a way, to dedicate it in this way. But he also has some interesting Terra captains that I'm interested to see. They weren't as eye-opening or as ones that I necessarily ranked as highly consistent as some of the other Terra captain choices in Brood Bonnet, Honchkrow and Hisuian Sliggoo, but I'm at very least interested to see particularly Brood Bonnet and now hopefully enabled to be used offensively under the sun with the Terra captaincy and see how it's able to do. Now the team does have some issues defensively wise, as some teams do. Something like a crown types are very tough to go up against. Just look at something like a week 6 matchup when Shaco King and Drew play, and there's a great toss from Shaco King's side. That matchup for Drew, as it currently stands with his roster, is going to be by far one of his toughest. Naturally, because Great Tusk is going to abuse that sun, get a photosynthesis boost, and I don't generally just see a switching for his side for crown type attacks, especially something like a Great Tusk. So I think just ground types in general are gonna be problematic for this team, and I do think in some regards it could have been done in a little bit different fashion as well when it comes to the pivots. I do think sometimes some teams also have a little bit of issue getting their offensive threats in freely without having to take too much damage in the progress, because your your weather setter in Torkoal obviously doesn't get access to momentum, and Drew kind of lacks those kind of like slow pivots that can take the hit, enable Walking Wake and Cinderace coming to the field more freely without taking that initial damage that is potentially thrown at you. So that's kind of my 2 cents on Drew's team, how I feel about it, and I'm gonna be letting Lux to tell his point of view, how he feels about Drew's team.
I would actually somewhat agree. It feels very sun reliant, as you said. That can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. I also personally viewed more as a bad thing. I'm not a fan of hard weather myself either. So, something that I do actually really like about this team, that this team has wall breakers that can just click their move, and they don't really need to click another move. I think some of the other teams have wall breakers that will need to predict a lot to catch the switch-ins, to be able to efficiently break teams. But with this team, you can just click Powerball with Cinderace and Sun. You can just click Hydro Steam or Draco with Walking Wake, and while it might be a bit of an issue early game, with like, oh, are they going in like a Water Absorb Mon? Are they going into a Fairy? Stuff like that. I think overall, a lot of these mons can just click their button, which is very nice. But as was mentioned, it just feels really sun reliant. Like, Brute Bonnet and Scovillain are decent, or well, solid options in sun. Outside of sun, versus like a bulky water ground, something like that, this team is going to struggle a lot, especially when this team is very weak to ground types, in my opinion. You do have Honchkrow and you do have Brute Bonnet as options, but Brute Bonnet is not that fast, and Honchkrow at 70 speed is also quite lackluster in terms of a speed option, which leaves you pretty vulnerable, in my opinion, because if you're bringing Regieleki, those ground types will come in, and if you can make a good double to Walking Wake, for example, that's very nice. You can get Walking Wake in for free. But if you don't, then where's your ground type switch in is my issue. I kind of have a similar feel with Ghost types, because again, it's Brute Bonnet and Honchkrow, which puts a lot of pressure on those mons defensively, in a sense. Well, they want to be more offensive, probably. And one last point that I want to point out is I don't love the WinCon options in outside of Sun, mainly, because Cinderace with Bulk Up is a decent one. You have Haxorus, but outside of that, it kind of ends there, because Mousehold with Tidy Up, it's not exactly consistent. Population Bomb is very strong, but having different stab or having a good coverage move pool is not something that has. Walking Wake as well, like Dragon Dance, is an option. It's not a particularly great one, in my opinion. So I don't love that about it.
And as the second slot in this draft, we had Nexus joining back in draft league scene, and who was also taking part of BBR last season as well. Somebody who we love to go up, love to go and see and watch to play. And he drafted Iron Valiant as their first pick, and which is gonna be very huge asset for him to utilize every single week, and it's one of the toughest mons to deal with. Variant fighting, of course, being very tough for many drafts to switch into, especially Fairy, which you're gonna be noticing a lot through these drafts that we go along. He also has very good offensive threats like Thunders and Salamence for setup options that they can do, or breaking wise, a very dependable pivots or walls in Slowking and Hippowdon, what they can do. Now, my issues with this trap particularly were that the hazard remover is very underwhelming, and that comes more in play particularly if you try to have a balanced draft like I feel like Nexus was trying to do. But when your remover is cryogonal, it's gonna limit the opportunities for Slowking and Hippowdon to run different kind of items like leftovers or reducing berries over heavy duty boots, which would be more likely to be the case that you want to put them on when you have a lack of remover on your roster. So there's a little bit of flaws in that regard. And it can be also be a little bit limited option for Iron Valiant to find enough offensive partners as well in some cases. And for me, I guess typing wise, which the team I found at least a little bit weak to would be Ice. And in that matter, I see it mostly because things like Salamence, Thunderous, and Hippowdon all together are pretty weak to Ice. And it puts a lot more pressure to mons like Slowking to having to take those kind of hits, and Slowking already seems like to be having a lot of weight on its shoulders to take some hits on this team as it is. So that can be typing wise for him to hardest to switching to, and from there on out I'm gonna be letting the floor to Lux actually next, who is gonna be talking about the team in itself, how he thinks about Nexus's draft.
I do have Nexus relatively high myself. I have them at 5. In their particular roles, all these mons are very solid. Like Slowking as just a generally slow, bulky pivot is probably one of the best that you can have, for example. However, the nitpick that I do have with that is that a lot of these picks are very one-dimensional. So, for example, Slowking is very good at being that bulky pivot, does have some setup options, but outside of that, it kind of lacks anything else. And I have that with a lot of these mons, like for example, Hippo is somewhat similar. It does have some like Wincon options or like cheese options, for example, while still being a very bulky pivot 90% of the time. But a lot of this team does one thing very well, and doesn't do a lot outside of that, outside of Iron Valiant, in my opinion. Which is both a positive and a negative, I'd say. But what I do like, what Veps has mentioned as well, I think the bulk on this team is very nice, with Slowking, Hippowdon, and then also Intimidate from Overquill helping with that, Cryogonal being able to sponge like the more special hits as well. So I do really like that, but as I mentioned, I don't necessarily agree with the team being very Fairy weak or Ghost weak, mainly because I don't feel like in this draft in particular there's a lot of strong Ghost types or strong Fairy types to worry about. Now, that might just be a personal preference thing, but I personally wouldn't say that is as relevant for me.
And then we have 5th on the draft order in itself. It's gonna be, funnily enough, the co-commissioner, I guess I can call her, Ellie. And she drafted Tornadus Therian round 1. And following up with another Therian in Landers Therian. And the draft goes from there in itself. And she has a very strong pivoting bulky offense team, if I could call it in itself. And in some cases, I do want to like this team, but there are some things that I do worry about it, and which is why it was not as highly ranked for myself. And there's gonna be mixed opinion on this. You're gonna be hearing that very shortly as well, because we also get to hear from Lux very shortly what he thinks about this. And he actually had the chance to help Ellie to draft this, so he has some insider input on this, what the draft was meant to be designed for. But for my behalf, my worries about the team in itself, that I find it being relatively fairy weak. The only resistance to fairy is Revaroom, and then there's a decent amount of fairy weaknesses, particularly Hydreigon quite weak to it, Hoopaban being weak to it, Hariyama being weak to it. And no other resistance again other than Revaroom in itself, which is gonna be one of her Terra captains, which also kind of puts in a pressure and awkward position her into that. If you do rely on Revaroom to be a resistance, how often can you like naturally Terralize it? Granted, one of her Terra typings will always be her stab on Revaroom, which on this case is poison, but still you would rather be able to be the natural resistance or have another one to enable Revaroom to be more flexible Terra Captain option, which I do think Revaroom honestly is a very good Terra Captain choice in this kind of format. And besides that, she also has Frostmoth as one of her Terra Captains, which both of them can be win-con options for herself as a setup side. But other than that, I wasn't also as happy that like a dedicated winning condition options that opponents have to be worried of, like, oh, I cannot lose to this, or like sweeping my team because it can up their speed and attack, what have you. And for her, mainly the ways that she can do that is by having Sword Dance or Landorus Therian, but it cannot Rock Polish anymore. She has Tornadus Therian with Nasty Plot, which can do that pretty well, and that's probably gonna be one of, outside of her Terra Captains, one of the best winning conditions by setup wise to have. And after that, it kind of goes to the point that the team is kind of dedicated on using momentum a lot and positioning breakers in and go from there, and hopefully have a dedicated Scalper in the back if there's a worry that Tornadus Therian cannot be the fastest one in the game to clean the game up in itself. Now, the other concerns that you may hear as well or notice about the draft in itself, besides typing wise fairy, is the remover part. And now a lot of teams will be having a lot of worry about removers, because that's kind of what we are dealing with in Generation now with the decks that we are dealing with. But you kind of always have to notice that it's not the most optimal for her team, in this case being Lurantis and Komala, both of them being her last two picks. So that is going to be Ellie's team, and like I said before a little bit, Lux is going to be actually now covering a little bit more in depth about his perspective about Ellie's team.
So yeah, honestly, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan just because I don't actually agree that this team has some wall breaking potential. I think this team has to be forced to have some wall breaker potential, and I'm mainly talking about maybe a choice specs at Dragon. I think this team has some really nice choice scarf users, but I'm not entirely sure. I think sometimes Ellie will have to bring a lot of choice scarfers. I think the best wall breaker of this team is going to be Upayu. Not sure if that's the best thing in the world. It's pretty good. I mean, it was pretty good during Gen 7. I'm not sure if it's gonna have the same impact that it had during Gen 7. The momentum, it's pretty cool. The removal, of course, I don't even know if there's removal on this team, honestly, because Lurantis Komala, it's tricky. Landorus losing Rock Polish, I think it hurts a lot this team, because if Landorus has Rock Polish, this team would be so much better. But with the speed tier, I'm not sure if Landorus will be able to do much of that wall breaking potential, because I think lacking Rock Polish means a lot with having so many threats that are faster than Landorus. Again, we are entering the same argument, like it's gonna need the choice scarf mainly. I'm personally not a fan. I think you all put like really nice points. I really don't think this has really good pivoting. I think it lacks wall breaking potential, because I think it's mainly Yupa, and I think Dragon will most likely be to have that wall breaking potential is gonna mainly have to bring like a choice packs. Other than that, I really don't think the wall breaking potential, but that's just me. On Tornadoes could have Nasty Plot as well, but I think it lacks, not being a Terra lacking knockoff. I'm not sure. I'm personally not a fan because I think as the pieces to be a really good team with the pivoting options, I don't agree it has the wall breaking potential. But again, I can be wrong. I can be proven wrong. But I think the team, it's not a team that I truly like.
The 9th pick in the draft is gonna be JV, and he drafted Greninja round 1, which is gonna be enabled to run Protein and Battle Bond on its set whichever ability he chooses to run. Now that comes obviously with a little bit of burden on its shoulders, because both of those abilities have been nerfed in this generation, as you may have already known, and I won't be covering it necessarily. If you don't know about this, you may want to Google this up right as you're listening to this, or check it from Showdown if you're curious. But saving time from there, we also see that JV was able to trap a couple of very strong setup threats that do possess a lot of threat to opponents, with Excalibur particularly is a very strong one, and Volcarona in right matchups can be very tough for opponents to always deal with, as we know about it by now. Now, from there, he also drafted the relatively, I would say, good supportive cast to enable these offensive modes of Greninja, Excalibur, and Volcarona to function the way that they would like to, with Serena being a remover that again is tough to come by these days. And while Serena got nerfed when it comes to its move pool, what it gets access to, it still is a rapid spinner after all, which is hard to come by. And then he was able to trap Sandy Shocks, which gets access to both Stealth Rocks and Spikes, but particularly Spikes is very nice to have, because then he also has Yuxi with Stealth Rocks, providing a little hazard stacking core, and therefore enabling the offensive threats to be able to break through their defensive checks that opponents might be bringing for them. And then he also has a Lolamark that I'm personally still a fan of, even after Generation 8 and 9, when the Super Berries haven't been 50%. I still do think a Lolamark has a lot of merit in this deck, particularly because it does get still access to knockoff, and it's a bulky dark type that can deal with some threats that would be worried about. Now, it comes a little bit of worry that it's also his poison type, and it leaves himself a little vulnerable to fairy type attacks, and therefore his only natural resistance to fairy are Volcarona and Earthworm. And from the latter one, we are talking about Earthworm without Shed Tail, and it's gonna be one of his Terra Captaincy options. So that is a little bit more to be desired, but thankfully, again, he has some decent natural bulk, at least from his pivots that he plans to use, but some of them obviously do lack a reliable recovery. So this team is kind of designed, as I can tell, to try to get the hazards up and then open up the offensive winning conditions. But if the game track allows to be a too long of a battle and JV gets stuck to get past certain things, I can see that being a little bit of an issue. And again, fairy types can also be a little bit of troublesome. And from there on out, I would want to also mention, before I let Wolf talk about the team a little bit further on, who seem to be a little bit more bigger fan than myself and some of the other analysts about this team of JV's. Something that I'm very curious and actually very excited for are JV's other two Terra Captains outside of the Earthworm by itself, which is the 2-point Electro, which I think is a great find for Nimble to be a Terra Captain, because now all of a sudden it gets access to coverage to be able to bypass the ground types. And he also has access to now Galar Articuno with Terra Captaincy, which I think by itself might be one of the mons that you're gonna be seeing that is changed drastically the most that's been drafted from being a Terra Captain, and then what we used to see it before when it wasn't getting access to, like, the obviously Terralization, like Gen 8 for example. So I do think Galar Articuno is gonna be very exciting and intriguing Terra Captain for all of us to follow how it's gonna be able to do in JV's hand. But now, not further ado, like I said, I would like to leave it to Wolf to leave his thoughts as well about JV's team.
Yeah, another thing I want to mention is what I find is another weakness of the team is it's kind of rock weak, or like the offensive breakers are rock weak, like your Bex and your Volcarona, like your setup sweepers. Like if you want to run bandit Bex, for example, in some matchup, you really gotta try to keep those hazards away and you only have the Serena. But even for that is the case, and even for I agree it doesn't have a lot of longevity or a lot of defense kinda, I put it as the third team in my ranking because I really like the style of the draft and I think it's a great team that definitely can run away with games. Like the backs, the Volcarona, the Greninja, and also the Articuno Galar with Terra, I think they are very, very threatening. And I can just see this team, you make one wrong move or you make one safe play and it just kind of runs away with the game.
And then as the fourth team in the draft order, we had the commissioner of the league, Jack/Gravy, following up next, and he drafted Enormous Incarnate as the round 1 pick, which is gonna be obviously there for their main mon that they're gonna be building around with. And I'm actually very high on this mon, regards to how well I do think it's gonna be able to perform in draft league. And you're gonna be noticing that a lot of teams are weak to Fairy, and Enormous Incarnate is gonna be right after obviously Iron and Valiant, one of the best Fairy types to utilize, especially offensively. And it's gonna be a mon that I think is gonna perform very well if Jack can position it very well throughout his weeks. And he also drafted a very top heavy but also very strong top heavy draft end from his side with the Gudra Hisui Mew. Even after it lost its recovery, if you can find the right sets which are either offensive or has a stacking lead, you can still get a good value out of Mew if you can find the versatility still to be something you can work with. Then you have Iron Hands, Arcanine Hisui, which can be offensively very tough for opponents to deal with. And alongside Mew, he also gets Tinglu, which is gonna be one of the best hazard setters across the board that you could ever draft when it comes to be able to set up stealth rocks and be able to set up spikes in itself. It's gonna be very strong 6 that he was able to select for himself. Now where this team kind of falls short in my eyes, and which was kind of difficult for others as well to kind of navigate where we were going with this draft with Jack's side, was the second half of the draft, because he has now 3 dark types in total in his draft with Tinglu, Hisuian Quillfish, and Alolan Persian. Granted, the latter 2 are Terra captains, so they can choose to be a different type, but now he would have to dedicate them to Terralize pretty quickly, because otherwise you're going to be sharing a lot of common weaknesses between each other, particularly Fairy, which, speaking of Fairy, is going to be one of the toughest typings for Jack to switch into. Thankfully he does have the Enormous Incarnate, because my god, he would not want to face one himself right now, considering the rest of his roster. And then as another typing that also will be relatively common for some teams to worry about will be also Crown, because we only have 1 Crown immunity naturally on the team with Enormous Incarnate. So there's typing wise some issues there that you would have to address on, or you have to be really focusing your prep on if you're Jack's side of things. And from there on out, I'm gonna be leaving the floor next for Wolf to address on what he thought about Jax's team.
Well, I gotta say, I agree with the top ones are great, and then it just kinda gets confusing. Now I'm less confused than I was at the start, because I see there have been changes. There's now Inteleon, and one of my biggest gripes I had with the team was, Lead, you have the Nemeris, but you didn't have anything that's faster. Like, you had a Sneasel, but it's a Sneasel. Do you really want to rely on a Sneasel to be your fast one? So I didn't like that. And yeah, I was mostly just confused. Like, it's a bulky offense team, and I think it can be great, but I just generally didn't like it. Especially also the only removal being Brambleghast. I thought you can definitely get Hazard stacked on, because Mew doesn't get defog anymore. So I put Gravy at the 11th spot myself.
Then we have Under the Radar following up as the 6th pick in this draft, and he was able to select Sneasler in round 1, which is gonna be obviously with access to Dire Claw, which is allowed. It's gonna be one of the most annoying things for many people to deal with, and this Pokemon can be absolute demon because of it. And it's a very good selection and a new toy to have for under the radar to have in this case. And then in a kind of like a under the radar fashion, you can notice if you have seen his draft league content before or seen him drafting, he does like to draft a team that has multiple hazard setters, removers, a wish passer, typically Vaporeon, which is one of his personal favorites, what I've been able to tell, and there's a good amount of momentum options as well on the team in itself. But there are some worries that on this team that many of us weren't able to necessarily rank him like on the top end of the draft necessarily. For myself, it was kind of dead in the middle on his case, because I was kind of worried that is there enough offensive prowess on this team compared to some of the other teams what they were able to assemble. Now, you do have Staraptor as a pure breaker, but you do have to worry about always that how long Staraptor can maintain in the battle in order to do the work. And you do obviously also make sure the stealth rocks aren't up to limit the opportunities the Staraptor gets to click Break Bird or Double Edge during the matchup. And from there, as a positive note that I like as an offensive synergy that I'm doing right now, actually in the league, in another Showdown league of my own, is the Zorok and Sneezer's combination. I love that combination, particularly because now Kelly can force some mind games, having Sneasler that is gonna be forcing a lot of Colver Cloaks by the opponent to try to avoid the cheese that Dialclaw has, which is 50% chance of getting like a 3 different type of status, including a sleep, which can be very detrimental on a wrong moment of the battle. And now you pair with it potential with the Zorok with the disguise, of course, and he gets access to knockoff, and therefore also putting a little worry for bulky ghost types that can deal with Sneasler naturally wise very well. Now you have to worry about if it's gonna be actually Sneasler or is it gonna be Zorok, who is gonna be popping you very hard with a Stab Knockoff or Star Dark Pulse, whatever it's gonna be. So I do like that aspect offensively from under the radar side, but I was hoping to see just a little bit more pure breaking options, that it kind of opens up this Sneasler easier for a late game sweeping option, because Sneasler can also be a unburdened sweeper, and he also did draft Thwacky as a potential support for that, because then Sneasler can run Crashy Seed and get the defense boost and use the item to get the unburden boost. So if he just had just a little bit more offensive prowess on his team, I feel like this draft could have been a lot higher in my rankings. He does have a very good Terra Captain option with a Dreadnought that on surface will be forcing a lot of preparation. It's just a matter of how well in practice it's gonna be able to do its stuff, but at least on the paper it should be providing much needed offensive pressure that we still besides it would like to see for him, but it's still good for him to have it there. So that's gonna be the Under the Radars team for my behalf, and we are gonna be hearing next from Lux's side how he felt about this team in itself.
I have this team quite a bit lower personally, at 12th. And I do think that this draft can take advantage of its offense relatively well through the momentum that is present, like Vaporeon, Baton Passing on grass and electric types into Iron Treads or Sneasler is, for example, very nice. But as you mentioned, like, I do see some struggles with this team offensively. Namely, what I don't like about this team is that there's not a lot of potent win cons. Like, as you mentioned, Sneasler is that really big threat. But then after that, to clean a game, it comes down to, like, Dreadnought clicking Shell Smash, which can be very strong, but is very predictable, in my opinion. And then Staraptor maybe clicking Choice Scarf and then clicking Button. But the win cons on this team that are present, in my opinion, can be very one-dimensional, like Sneasler through the terrain or proccing Fake Out, normal gem. Like, I think that is a very, like, one-dimensional way to get into the win con, and if that works out, it'll work out great. But if it doesn't, I think this team might struggle heavily in that area. And another thing that I didn't love about this team is that a lot of the momentum options on this team don't love running momentum. Like, for example, Sneasler, if it wants to be a win con, it's going to be harder to run U-turn, for example. Iron Treads, with Volt Switch, it already has pretty heavy 4 move slot syndrome between Rocks, Knockoff, Earthquake, Steel Move, Rapid Spin, and adding Volt Switch to that mix, while it can definitely be run, might be tough. The same for Vaporeon. Pretty heavy 4 move slot syndrome, in my opinion, as a Mon. Wanting to run Water Move, Wish, Protect for reliable recovery, and then wanting to generally have like Haze or Yawn to make it less passive and force it to not be set up on. And then, like, for example, Mesprit again has a lot of options already, and then having to try and fit U-turn on it might not be great. Staraptor wants to click buttons more so than not, rather than click U-turn. And then Rotom can be very nice for that, and I think that is probably the most consistent one on this team. But as I'm trying to say, like, it already has like relatively limited offensive Mons, in my opinion, and then also it can struggle to bring those in, which I personally don't love at all.
And then as the 10th pick in this draft, we have Mephisto to cover next, who drafted GU round 1, and not only that, he also managed to draft an Iron Bundle, or Brundle as I would like to call it, myself particularly. And having those two Mons buy together, which both of them should have gone round 1 in this dex compared to what was available, I think it's quite of a steal for Mephisto, obviously, to be able to get both of them. It's a little ridiculous that people were allowing this to happen, but I can, I guess, also understand, because those Mons are very one-dimensional offensive threats, what they do. Like, if you don't enjoy clicking one attacking move all the time and necessary with them, and you don't find yourself be able to be flexible, I can understand in some regards why this was being able to happen as it occurred in this draft. But it's still kind of crazy to think about, considering how much power they have. And now from there on out, obviously, besides those big two powerhouses that Mephisto has, he has obviously very top heavy draft by naturally going in with those two picks, but with the rest of the draft too, because there aren't too many necessary like quote-unquote bad Mons that he drafted, because the lowest point total Mon that he drafted was Hisuian Decidueye, or Decidueye, as somebody who watches Wolfie Click, that's obviously how we know he likes to pronounce the Mon, so apologize if that sometimes gets through my accent as it is. But again, like I said, he has a lot of like very highly valuable Mons on his draft, and therefore the roster size is smaller as well as a trade-off, which you can take it as two ways. You can see it as a vulnerable situation to leave yourself into, because you can be very predictable or more predictable than others what Mons you're going to be bringing to battles. But on the other hand, you also then have a lot more quality of a Mons to pick from, like things like the Donovan, Sylveon, and Slowbro can be very dependable defensive core by themselves, and then you have a very reliable remover in Donovan, a lot more reliable than most drafts will end up having, which is very important for a team with GU and Brundle to enable them to run more items than heavy duty boots most of the week, which makes it more scarier for opponents to deal with. And then you have likes of again the Hisuian Decidueye as a Terra Captain, which was the lowest point Mon, and then you have something like a Low Kicks, which is gonna be a Terra Captain as well, which basically was utilized in a way that it has very strong stabs to now utilize as a priority. So for me, I actually valued this draft relatively high, because again, for me, compared to the rest of the teams, which 6 he can kind of select for every single week, is gonna be very highly valuable compared to some of the other teams that are enabled to do, and they are very well synergizing together. Now, my one worry about this team, besides the roster size that could be a case, is the fact that some of the supporting Mons that are coming behind GU and Bundle are very slow naturally as well, like things like Donphan, Sylveon, and Slowbro together are very slow together, and therefore the matchup wise he might be more in a he's gonna be able to move a lot slower than opponent in most cases, unless it's gonna be things like Gio and Brando. But I'm gonna leave it from there for Wolf to cover this team, who was a little bit on the opposite side of the things when it comes to like how he feels about having a more limited size of roster than some of the other teams.
So I personally had a bit of trouble ranking this team. I put them in the 10th spot at the end, but I could have also put them lower, but I wasn't sure. But there were things I liked, and there were, well, okay. Let's say one thing, you really need those hazard removal options every time, because you have the GU, you have the bundle, and you really have the low kicks. And I think the low kicks is an integral part of this draft, actually, because your other mons don't really like to click their momentum moves at all. And also you want more physical breaking power. So I think low kicks will have to come a lot. But I also think low kicks is actually a really good mon, especially with Terra. So if you can remove those rocks, and if you can just U-turn spam with low kicks, I think this team can actually work well. But it has it also has glaring flaws, most that you already mentioned anyways. And I also don't like how kinda top heavy it is. Like you have the GU, you have the bundle, and you kind of have the low kicks, and those have to do the damage. And you have the Sylvan and the Slowbro, and those kind of have to be the defense. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of variety you can play with.
For those that I wanted to wait on this and how I feel about Zoe's team, well, here we are finally. And he drafted Hisuian, Samurott, and Annihilate basically as a dual picks because he's the will pick. And those were kind of like his foundation, what he did his draft around. And then he has a Heatran and Dragonite to follow it up with, and it goes from there. I do like this starting point, particularly the first 3 or 4 Pokemon particularly, not because they are so highly valued by points wise, but also how they function together naturally, what they do typing wise, or what moves they are clicking naturally as well. Because if you think about Hisuian Samurott, this is going to be the Greninja, this is going to be the Galar Loki, this is going to be one of these monsters that once it get introduced to us in Draft League scene, its popularity will go up, its price will go up, and it's going to be even more desirable for people to want it to give it a try. It's going to be even harder for people to get access to, and PokeMD wasted no time picking it right away, and I don't necessarily blaming him for that, because I got to try this thing actually in a showdown tournament, and I fell in love with it. Why? Because the signature move is such a free move to click, as we know, with the sharpness boosted and giving you free spikes, which is phenomenal offensive tool to have, and something that Joey can utilize, pairing it with a ghost type with Annihilate, and also him having access to Defiant on that mon, making it basically a mon that will always punish any kind of hazard remover if they're gonna be trying to go for it, because there's not really any hazard removal other than Tidy Up for Mousehold, or Glimora by itself, but with its signature move Mortal Spin, I believe it was called a poison type move, that can remove those hazards. Now, he also packed a lot of fairy weakness with his first 2 picks with Samurott, Hisui, and Annihilate, and he paired that right away with a mon that quad resist fairy is probably one of the best fairy checks in the game still to this day, being Heatran, and also covering him Stealth Rock support as well, so Annihilate won't be hopefully ever having to run those Stealth Rocks on itself, and a Heatran can be doing that very reliably from there on out. And then Dragonite being a very strong setup sweeper and a crown immunity is a very nice pairing to have in itself, and giving him a very strong foundation as the top 4 to work with. Then from there on out, honestly, in some cases you can see that what he was able to do with it, and what are the upsides offensively with things like Electro, Hisui, and Delphox being the Terra captains. Lucian Rock does being very good offensive mon even to this day. I do think it's a very anti-meta mon in some cases, because there's gonna be a lot of highly tiered mons that are gonna be weak to its moves that he get access to, even the priority move by itself. And then he has things like Galar Slowbro as a grounded poison type, and another sturdy fairy resistance, which is nice to have. My worries on this team in particular is that he wasn't able to assemble himself a reliable rapid spinner, which would have enabled him to avoid taking hazard damage and therefore freeing up potentially Dragon Knight having not to run heavy duty boots all the time to worry about its multi-scale being broken. And the fact that naturally, until he terrorizes any of his Terra captains, he would also have right now 3 psychic types on his draft, and quite a few things besides therefore are now along with Annihilate that are weak to Ghost, without having normal type on his draft. He does have 2 dark types, which is worthy to mention, but I do think it's still a little bit of worry to go along. Now, in some cases, I do also like the fact that he does have a sturdy crown immunity other than Dragon Knight in Cresselia. So in some senses, I actually do like the fit, even though I don't normally actually like using Cresselia in draft. I'm gonna be saying it as it is. Like, some people may find Cresselia to be very good in draft. Some people like me find it a little bit being a setup fodder and a little bit passive in some cases. But if you find that very good niche for it, there is value there. And for his niche is that it gives him a Lunar Dance, which is basically a healing wish in simpler words if you forget what that move does. But it gives him basically a second life to any of his offensive threats, which he has plenty of to choose from. So there on fourth, while he has 3 psychic types, I personally at least do like Cresselia out of those, particularly where it fits. But that's gonna be my thoughts on Joey's team, and I'm gonna be leaving it to Wolf to leave it the final thoughts on Joey's team.
This might be a hot take, but I'm just gonna say it. I think Ceaseless Edge might be the most broken move that Pokemon has ever introduced. Being able to set spikes while clicking a move is essentially free value every turn for 3 turns. And the way it generates even more values, even if you do get to remove those, which is gonna be hard due to Annihilate, if you remove those, then Samurott just gets free value once again by clicking the move and not having to predict. I think that is a huge strength for this team personally. As Pepsi said, in Tour he played on Showdown, Samurott Hisui was very good. In general Showdown Tour play for draft, Samurott Hisui has been incredible. It has been moving up in points consistently, so I think this might be one of the most underrated Mons at the moment, and I'm interested to see where that goes. But something else I do really like about this team, that there's a lot that makes you want to click the attacking move, like Dragonite with multi-skill or Samurott Hisui not wanting to let it get free Ceaseless Edge. And well, Fairy is pretty strong. You do have that Heatran, you do have that Galarian Slowbro as options to pivot in on those Mons. But back to my original point, you want to click a move to break the multi-scale on Dragonite. You want to click a move so that Samurott doesn't get free value, and that's where Annihilate can get its free Rage Fist boost, which I think personally is very nice for this team. And something that I also quite like is that, which I've mentioned for some other teams, but a lot of the offensive threats pressure like the same type of Pokemon. Like for example, Samurott, Annihilate, and Dragonite, and even Crook with some of their stamps really pressure Fairy type Pokemon. But you have good answers to those, and on top of that, a single Fairy type can't deal with all of those Pokemon, which puts a lot of pressure on those types of Mons to get answers. Yet, you want to add something?
I just want to answer that an offensive Fairy type, which also has ground coverage, will demolish all of those Mons.
I do think that could be very tough, but from an offensive perspective of this team, which I think you mentioned as well, like this team is more of an offensive style, I think that can be very nice. Now, I don't remember if this was mentioned, but I actually find that the natural speed is somewhat lacking on this team. Yes, Electrode can outspeed a lot of Mons. It doesn't force anything else to come down to it just because it's that fast. And other than that, you only really have Lycanroc and Delphox, which I don't love when you have to bring those top, or well, you don't have to, but you're probably bringing those top 4 every game. only having Lycanroc and Delphox as like those speed options that force other Pokemon to maybe run like a timid nature or a jolly nature could be of detriment to this team. And as was mentioned before, the only like really reliable like momentum mon, or somewhat reliable momentum mon on this team is Annihilate, which, while it can be decent, it doesn't want to be forced into that role, and it might cause Joey to struggle getting in his Samurott to click Cecil's Edge, struggle in getting his Heatran to click strong special attacks, as that is the main special attacker on this team, as far as I can see, other than like Delphox and Electrode, which are more lower tier options, which I don't love. And then like getting Dragonite in safely can also be tough with that. I ranked him 6th.
And then the 7th draft that we are gonna be covering gonna be Envy, and he drafted Ursaluna in round 1, which is obviously one of the more exciting new mons that we get access to now after the home was released. And Ursaluna is gonna be paired with pretty much with a very balanced roster, I would say, and a lot of momentum initiative that can very well work with Ursaluna. And for me, this was one of the higher end of the draft by itself, because it looks very looks very consistent to me, that what you can try to do with it, at least from my point of view on. But something that I was hoping to see maybe more out of this draft that hopefully Envy was able to fix, or maybe can fix later on if it comes available to him, and if he agrees even this being necessary a need for himself, how he plans to use the draft, would have been added more Trick Room element to the team. Because right now your Trick Room setters are Screaming Tail, or Screamtail has a properly, but I like to call it Screaming Tails. That mon does get access to Trick Room, and it can go for like a slow button pass under the Trick Room, because it's so fast naturally to get Ursaluna for free. I do hope that kind of scenario comes in play this season, that MV can use it that way. But enabling using Screaming Tails of wide move pool and the options that it has, what I've been able to see some other courses to do very well with, I would have liked to see another like reliable Trick Room setter on the roster. Now the other one that there is technically is Meowscarada, but I don't think MV is gonna be using hopefully Meowscarada that way, that it's gonna be just a Trick Room bot for Ursaluna. Meowscarada has way too many other options that it can do, and be very valuable natural speedy mon and knockoff user for the team, and also setting up potentially spikes if the fortress is not there to do. Now MV did manage to draft a relatively good hazard remover options with fortress and Quackle if called upon, but mostly the fortress in itself is very dependable rapid spinner compared to, again, majority of the teams, and therefore he at least addressed that weakness that current draft decks that we are working on does have in it. And when it comes to Terra Captains, I think he had a very interesting and exciting choices, at least for me to follow personally, with Hoopa being one of his Terra Captains, which is like a very offensive choice of a Terra. Like you think about Hoopa and it's gonna be pretty much using it offensively by its advantage, and maybe in a pinch it can help it to live a certain hit depending on what it turns into. And the Dunsparce case, it's gonna be more so a utility Terra Captain that may enable it to be a nice wall to deal with something, or it may enable it to use Calm Mindset, for example, a lot more freely than being a pure normal type in certain matchups. So to me, Terra Captain wise, I think MV did a pretty good job that I wanted to mention about this, but obviously there's always some flaws as well, that the team might be a little too reliant in some cases to rely on Ursaluna to do the breaking. He does have some decent offensive options outside of the Terra Captain of Hoopa, with like Quackable being a very good winning condition with setup. Meowscarada naturally has a lot of good move pool, wide move pool to work with. Salazo in a right matchup can help with that, or be a Starbreaker with the Toxic set. But other than that, there's maybe would have been ideally to be seen maybe another like a strong breaker to enable or free up rather, Ursaluna not having to carry too much of a load on its shoulders, even though it has pretty big and wide shoulders as it is. It's a freaking bear after all. But that's gonna be my perspective on MV's team, and now we are gonna be hearing from, as I'm gathering my notes for this, we are gonna be hearing from Lux actually once again what he thinks about this team in itself.
I would actually like to mention, there's another mon on this team that does get Trick Room, and that is Masquerada. Now, does that make the point better? For me, it doesn't. There's still a lack of Trick Room support, which I do agree with. And something else that I didn't love is due to the way the team is structured, in a sense, a lot of the offensive Pokemon like resist several types that the defensive checks don't really like tanking. Like, for example, MV's Steel type Fortress does not resist Rock, while Ursaluna is the only Rock resist on this draft. I don't love that. Ursaluna already like kind of struggles with longevity due to like having to get burned to get the max amount of potential out of Facade, for example. And then, for example, as well, Fortress, once again being the only ice resist on this team, isn't great when the only other options are Salazzle and Quaquaval, and I guess Ice Q as well, but none of those really love switching into a strong Ice Beam or a strong Freeze Dry for that matter.
Let's not ignore Grumpig. It has
Thick fat Grumpig, yeah, you're right. No, but I don't love that combination, since it makes you have to throw in these offensive mons that already somewhat struggle with longevity, other than Quaquaval, since Quaquaval does have the Roost as well, which could be hard to fit depending, but that's probably a little too reading too much into things. I will say this team has very strong hazard control, which I think will enable both like offensive and defensive playstyles for MV. I didn't love the overall feel of this draft, and my partner agreed with me in that. So we did rank it relatively low at 10th, but neither of us thought it was necessarily a bad team. It was more so like a vibe check, if anything.
And then we have the second last team to cover. There were actually pretty juicy names at the end of it, at least for myself particularly. Now, somebody that may not be as well known for casual fans, but obviously all who have been following Draft League, especially last generation, will recognize the big name of Montai. Now, Montai is obviously a very capable player, if I say so myself, and one of the better players you're gonna be finding. And for me, his draft is actually probably one of the better ones I've seen him drafting. Now, obviously, we are ranking just drafts and not coaches, so I'm making this sure that I'm not going biased when it comes to talent of coaches in this league and where who drafted what teams. But I do genuinely think Montai may have done the best work in his draft compared to his competition. If you consider his positioning in the draft, he was the second last pick, and for me, he has one of the top 3 teams that he was able to draft, at least in my power rankings. Mainly because he was able to start his draft off very strongly with Galar Slowking and Gotsum together, which are very nice pairing together in itself, because Galar Slowking may sometimes, even when access to Flamethrower, may struggle with some bulky steel types to bypass them too, and you get Gotsum with momentum move freely in from there, and both of them together provide a lot of hazards together, because Galar Slowking gets now access to Toxic Spikes, you have Spikes and Stealth Rocks through Gotsum already on your first 2 picks, and you have offensively pretty good synergy there. And obviously Gotsum doesn't like bulky fairy types, Galar Slowking doesn't care about those at all, naturally by itself. So I do think it's a very nice pairing, and it's been commonly seen by somebody like CP Marcus, for example, who is a huge Galar Slowking advocator. He advocates on drafting very strong ground types together, and that's not something that I don't think is gonna be uncommon to see when you see people drafting Galar Slowking these days, or even like Generation 8, and Montai kind of took the similar approach in that regard, like I said with the Gotsum. And then he has some very good Terra captains that I do think are worth to mention here. Kilo Watcher particularly, and Zetitan. the Titan can be one of the most enticing and maybe one of the kill leaders just purely from just Terra Captains or even in general in the league, because how good of a Terra Captain it can be when it can change its type, because being a pure Ice type will put you in a struggle when you can get up your setup, but if you can change that type and gain another stab to it besides Ice, now we are talking. Now we are getting into a situation that the Titan can really be positioned really well in draft league scene and do very well. And obviously with Galaxy Longing Snowscape providing the snow boost, the Titan can naturally gain the defense boost even before being terrorized, which is really cool. And Kilowatt Rule being one of the few mons that gets access to Weather Ball is actually really cool to see in here, because now it also has Tyranitar with Sand that provides the rock type of Weather Ball as well, besides the Ice type from Galaxy Longing's move that enables the Snowscape to be up. He also has a very decent like a Trick Room option on his team. He has good amount of priority, strong priority in a Prelume and Scissor, and he also has very solid bulk dual regenerator core with the Galaxy Longing and Alamomola all together as it is. So I do think, again, based on the position on the draft where he was slotted, I think Mountain did very good job what he was given hands to. And for me, this was a very highly rated draft, like I said, for myself personally. Now, not just to make it about, again, like as we have gone thus far, just from my point of things, I'm gonna be letting Lux to tell his side on the Montage team, which is gonna be a little bit different from my own perspective, and which you're gonna be able to tell where he ranked the team himself.
So I actually disagree with the win con point. While a lot of these mons can be win cons, I don't think any of them want to be every week. Like, obviously there is a lot of options, and
but that's precisely my point. He can decide each week which one functions best.
I do think that's a fair point to have, but I don't love a lot of these win conditions. Like, for example, the Titan can be very reliant on that snow, which forces Slowking into a certain role in a week. Garchomp doesn't have Skill Shot anymore, so it's not as consistent as a win condition in my opinion. Scizor does not have Roost anymore, it's not as consistent of a win condition anymore. And then stuff like Tyranitar I don't find as particularly consistent win conditions either. So personally, I don't love that as much as an aspect for this team. Well, I can see why someone else would like it a lot more than myself. But something else that I don't love about this draft is actually its kind of lack of good hazard control. No spikes on this draft. You do have T-spikes, and you have 2 rockers, which, while they're consistent rockers, they don't want to run rocks every week with T-Tar and Garchomp. Garchomp might want to run Earthquake, Dragon Move, Swords Dance, and then Coverage, for example, to be that win condition. Or Tyranitar with Dragon Dance, or having a set that cripples more with Thunder Wave, for example. I don't think fitting rocks is going to be as easy, and the removal, and there are no spikes, also doesn't help that, and then also the removal being Scizor and Drifblim is not great. While Hatterene does help with that with Magic Bounce, I don't think that makes up for it necessarily. I will say, I do think this is a very fat team, due to Slowking, Galar being there. Garchomp with fat sets is very tough to break. Scizor, while not having Roost anymore, still has pretty solid natural bulk. The Titan has good natural bulk. Ursaring with Eviolite now can be very fat. Hatterene with Draining Kiss does have some form of longevity. Tyranitar with the Sand can be very especially fat as well. So I do like that, but in the end, to me, this team wasn't as good as some of the teams that I have above it. So I put it at 7th, still top half, but I personally didn't love it as much.
And then at 3rd in the draft order, we are going to be covering Shaco King, who drafted Great Tusk in round 1 as well. And for me, this was one of the better drafts. For me, thus far, we have noticed that, like, as you've seen from the graphics, like for me, Addison was the #1 ranked team. Shaco King, funnily enough, being the 3rd pick in the draft, end up being 3rd in my He was actually not third, he was actually second in my power rankings, so I need to correct myself very briefly there. But he had a very strong foundation in his draft earlier on in his draft. When you look at his first half, that he was able to draft between Great Tusk, Goldenko, Sarud, Azumarill, Noivern, Tinkaton, and Quagsire. I feel like those mons together already as it is that he was able to assemble is gonna be very easy and dependable for him to bring almost every single week. And then there on fourth, I think he has a lot of good options. So which mons are gonna be defensive that week, in which way they're gonna be built on defensively. Offensively wise, with you turning Noivern, he has a very good offensive breakers to utilize that momentum in Great Tusk and Goldenko, because Noivern is gonna be luring in those fat steel types or fat fairy types usually. So he does have good breakers to enable to utilize Noivern's pivoting moves. And also across the board, Shakuking by far has the best hazard control and hazard setting options on his team. Like Great Tusk and Noivern are one of the best removers that you can have in this deck, and he has a plethora of stealth rockers, spikers, and T-spike options as well on his roster that are very good. For me, where this draft kind of fell short compared to some of, for example, like Addison's team, for example, that I wasn't able to put it as high and make it number one for myself, for example, was that I find the 3 mons, particularly from his second half of the draft, that aren't Terra captains like Mach, Braviary, and Sableye, slightly undependable to be able to be brought into every single game or even majority of the games. Now, obviously, with being a lower tier budget mons, that will be the case, but particularly the fact that the Mach, being his grounded poison type, is gonna be a mon that I'm not sure how often he can bring, even after the buffs that he got, like access to toxic spikes, for example. I feel like it's gonna leave him slightly vulnerable with some of his mons from prior and upper end of his draft that can get affected by T-spikes. He might be a little vulnerable to those, but that's like my slight concern about the team. Terra captaincy wise, Jolteon and Espeon are actually very good Terra captains in my opinion as well, and they were some of the probably the best ones out of the choices that we have seen thus far. I do think Addison also has a very good sleeper pick in Tatsugiri, and the Tauros are very good. Nexus, I think, outside of Lucianrock Day was a little bit more to be desired, but for Shakuking's case, I think he went very well with his Terra Jolteon and Terra Espeon as their Terra captains with the typings that they do get access to. So that's gonna be Shakuking for my behalf, and we are gonna be hearing from Bruno/Squid. It's gonna be because they worked actually as a pairing to make their rankings. So you're gonna be hearing from one of them at this point of time after I stop speaking about this particular team, how they felt about Shakuking's draft from their perspective.
So I want to say that when I first looked at this team, it didn't strike me as nothing. It did strike me as nothing special. But Bruno was actually the one to convince me of the brilliance of this team.
I will say if we were doing the rankings, 2 separate rankings, I would put Shuckle higher and Squid will put him lower because really this one.
We ranked him at 6th. But I gotta say that now that I'm looking at this team once again, I'm liking it even more. But I do want to say something about the Quagsire, having used it for a season. Quagsire this gen is one of those mons that is like, okay, here's this setup sweeper, I'm gonna use Quagsire to wall it. Oh no, he's a Terra captain. Oh, I'm gonna use Quagsire to wall this mon instead. Oh no, it learns Trailblaze. Quagsire is really hard to fit into the tank role this gen, in my opinion. But I do like the double EV Terra captaincy. It's gonna be amazing for him. And I just want to reinforce the thing that Fepsis was talking about the momentum of the team. With Noivern and Zarud, the mons they invite in are breakthrough Great Tusk, Goldengo, and the Azumarill. So it's really easy for him to set his breakers and threats on the field.
One of the more highly ranked teams across the board, according to our analyst, myself included. I had her first, mainly due to the fact that I saw her draft being very well put together around her first pick that she selected in Dragapult. Now, I also might have a slight bias towards this, of course, because I'm actually helping her throughout this season, and there were parts of the draft that I was giving my opinions on what have you, but it was nice to see, at least for my own sake, that I'm not being necessarily biased about how I think about this team, because many people, myself included, like I said, are seeing this draft being very highly ranked and very well put together. And the reasonings for myself personally are due to the fact that the Dragapult is very well supported offensively wise. She has King Gambit, which is a phenomenal partner offensively that myself I got to use in another league, and they work really well together, taking care of those bulky fairy types that may want to deal with Dragapult, especially if they are built as special defensive. Then you have Glimora there as a hazard setter, which is very good combined with Galad Zapdos as well. With Defiant to deter hazards removers like Defogers to really click Defog versus her, besides the fact that she also has Spin Blocker in Dragapult naturally. So there's also very good options for choice carvers that eliminate that specific role for Dragapult to be in, like Galad Zapdos, which was mentioned. Gardevoir and Rotomore, for example, are very good scarfers as well. And there's a good amount of mixture of special and physical attackers across the board that also should enable her to run more flexible Dragapult sets every single week, and it's not pigeonholed into any particular type of role offensively, like being a physical attacker or a special attacker or a choice in that matter. She should have enough tools offensively to make it work. Now, there are definitely some flaws, and every single draft will have flaws, even how highly you would think of them. For me, her main flaws on her draft defensively, which comes no surprise necessary if the team is very offensively drafted, you're gonna have defensive flaws, and particularly typings like Fairy and Ground can be very tough for her to switching to, because the switchings that she has for those typings naturally are most likely offensively naturally, likely Mora or Rotomore, for example, or Galad Zapdos. When you think about the typings that I mentioned, like either Crown or Fairy, they are pretty much offensively naturally by their stat contribution. So that's pretty much the addition, and you're gonna be hearing my second host who is gonna be coming in on this, that is gonna be talking about their perspective, and it's gonna be actually Wolf that you get to hear from next about this team as well.
I do agree that Edison's team is great. I like it. It's an offensive team. It has, in my opinion, the best Dragon Steel Fairy Core in the whole draft. And yeah, and I love the Terratauros personally. But, and even the weaknesses, they aren't that bad. Like you could say, oh, there's only one spinner, but you don't really need it. And yeah. But for me, it's still not the best draft. Like, it's great. For me, it's the number 2 draft. There's just one draft that I like, not even a little, that I definitely like more.
And there you have it, and that's gonna be all about for us as the analyst who did the power rankings about the drafts in this season of PPL Season 1. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Leave a like, subscribe if you're new to this channel. Make sure to follow all the coaches in the league, because there's gonna be a lot of fun battles for you all to watch for sure, and myself included in that as well. And stay tuned to this channel particularly as well, because there's gonna be more analyst stuff coming into your way, so you won't be missing out on any of them. But thank you all for watching, and I'm gonna be seeing you guys later.